Okay, we're going to take a look at one of the most important biochemical processes in organisms called photosynthesis. And what we're going to look at is we're going to have a bit of a look at the two main stages of photosynthesis, how they work, how they interact with each other, and basically how we take our inputs and produce our outputs. So this video is not going to teach you everything you need to know, but it's certainly going to give you a good look at the process targeted at the VCE level. So we're going to assume a couple of things. We're going to assume you've got some understanding of the chemical equation for photosynthesis, which we've put up there. So we know that 6 carbon dioxide plus 6 H2O in the presence of sunlight and chlorophyll will in fact produce 1 molecule of glucose, which is C6H12O6, and 6 molecules of oxygen. Also going to assume you've got an understanding of where photosynthesis takes place, and in our autotrophic organisms, particularly our plants, which have specialised structures in their cells called chloroplasts. You can see we've drawn our chloroplast around there. And the chloroplast itself has two main structures within it. It has this structure on the left here, which we've labelled thylakoids. Now each of these little flattened discs is a thylakoid, and a stack of these discs is what we call a granum. Surrounding our stacks of thylakoids is a fluid-filled space called the stroma, and that's all the space that surrounds all our granum. So let's take a bit of a look now at the process. For our purposes, we're going to actually split our chloroplast into two main sections, because as I said before, photosynthesis has two main stages. Our first stage of photosynthesis is called our light-dependent stage, and it takes place in the thylakoid membranes. Our second stage of photosynthesis is called our light-independent stage, don't know what I was writing there. That looks better. And it takes place in the stroma. So I'm not trying to mislead you and think that the chloroplast is split in half like that, but I think you will get the idea, and it will certainly make this explanation a little bit more simple. So let's look at the light-dependent stage first. The first thing that happens in the light-dependent stage is basically we have light entering the chloroplast and entering the thylakoids. Just label light up there. And within our thylakoid membranes is a whole heap of pigment molecules called chlorophyll, which you would probably be familiar with. They're the things that give leaves their green colour. And the chlorophyll traps the light, and by trapping the light, it actually provides energy to synthesise ATP. So what we have is we would have ADP plus inorganic phosphate coming in, and by using the energy provided by sunlight, we've got enough energy to attach the phosphate to ADP, which, as you guys will already know, will make us some ATP. And ATP is very, very important, well, for everything, but particularly the light independent stage, because it won't work if it doesn't have energy in the form of ATP. The other thing that happens in the light-dependent stage of photosynthesis, so besides generating our ATP, is we actually have water that comes into the system. So we'll draw that down the bottom there, some H2O, water. So water comes into the thylakoids, and it actually interacts with the light as well. And this time what the light does is it actually splits the water molecule apart. So that's a process we call photolysis. And if you split a molecule of H2O, what you're left with is some hydrogen, 2 in fact, and they'll have some electrons with them. And you're also left with oxygen. And what happens to the oxygen is quite simple. Because we've got a single oxygen there, it'll pair with another oxygen, and that'll leave the system, leave the chloroplast as oxygen, O2. And that could do two things. It might actually exit through the stomata and be oxygen released to the atmosphere, or plants are actually really quite self-sufficient. They could use that oxygen to drive cellular respiration in themselves. So there's a quick little look at how we produce oxygen, which is one of our outputs of photosynthesis, using light. We're still left with our hydrogen ions and our electrons, and they don't just stay there. We actually need those guys in the light independent stage. They're really important for the light independent stage. So we need a way of transporting them over there. And fortunately enough, we've got these little taxi molecules in our chloroplasts that actually taxi the hydrogen ions and their electrons from the light dependent stage over into the light independent stage. So our taxis are actually called acceptor molecules. So a taxi comes in, and the taxi picks up the hydrogen ions and electrons, and then the taxi leaves. Molecule. So our acceptor molecule coming in, if you have a look up the top there, we'd say that's unloaded because it hasn't got any passengers at the moment. So our unloaded acceptor molecule comes in, it travels down and picks up the hydrogen ions and electrons that have been released from splitting water. Those guys jump on our acceptor molecule, so we'd now say we've got a loaded acceptor molecule, and that acceptor molecule will drive them over to stage 2, the light independent stage, drop them off, and they'll get used up there. Now, the story doesn't quite stop there with our acceptor molecules. We actually give them a special name. So our unloaded acceptor molecule, up the top there, we call NADP+. And when NADP+ picks up its passengers in the form of hydrogen ions and electrons, it actually becomes what's known as NADPH. And that's the word we give to our loaded acceptor molecule that's travelling over to the light independent stage. So just to recap there, we know photosynthesis, one of the inputs is water, so we can now see water is actually used in the light independent stage. Photosynthesis requires sunlight and chlorophyll, and you can also now see that sunlight and chlorophyll are required in the light dependent stage, hence its name. And we also see that photosynthesis produces oxygen, and you can now account for the production of oxygen, which has been produced by splitting the water molecule in the light dependent stage. So the only things left to use from our equation are our carbon dioxide, and we need to still produce some glucose. So let's have a look at that now. So moving on to the light independent stage, which occurs in the stroma, we're going to keep it really nice and simple. Basically, we have a cycle, which we call the Calvin cycle. So if I draw a little cycle there, so we've got our cycle which goes around, and into our cycle we have carbon dioxide, and out of our cycle, you might have guessed already, we have glucose, C6H12O6. So in its simplest form, the light independent stage takes carbon dioxide and it converts it into glucose, and the glucose is stored by the plant and used by the plant. Now, if you have a look at those two formulas for carbon dioxide and glucose, you can see glucose requires carbon, which we're going to get from carbon dioxide. Glucose also requires oxygen, and that's fine because we'll get oxygen from carbon dioxide as well. The thing that carbon dioxide can't give us is the hydrogen, and glucose needs 12 of them. So luckily for us, the light dependent stage has actually produced some hydrogen ions for us. So our acceptor molecules that have come into the system, what they'll do is they'll drop off the hydrogen ions and the electrons. And they'll actually be integrated with the carbon dioxide, and through a number of specialised processes, they're used to turn that into glucose. The only other thing we need to account for now is our ATP. Now, this cycle, which I should say is called the Calvin cycle. This cycle, called the Calvin cycle, which is so good at converting carbon dioxide into glucose and mixing that together with our hydrogen ions and electrons, it's only good to us if it's got energy to make it work. So we actually need to supply it with some ATP, and by giving it ATP, the cycle will work. Let's look back at the light-dependent stage again. The first thing we talked about was how it produces ATP, and that ATP is transferred over to the light-independent stage, which we can see here, and we can sort of draw a little arrow there to indicate that ATP is used in the Calvin cycle. And now, to recap our process of the light-independent stage, we've now used carbon dioxide, which, looking at our formula, was the other input of photosynthesis. We've now produced glucose, which was the other output of photosynthesis we hadn't allowed for, and we've done that by using the products of the light-dependent stage in the form of ATP and in the form of hydrogen ions and electrons. So there you go. Hopefully that's not too confusing for you. If you found this easy, you can certainly break it down in a lot more detail, looking at these processes a bit more deeply. But for our VCE level, this is going to give you a really good understanding and a good ability to be able to answer any questions that come at you about photosynthesis. Thank you.